The storm had been raging for 3 days when Jake Morrison first heard the whisper that would change his life forever. Thunder cracked overhead as he guided his horse through the muddy streets of Cedar Falls. Water cascading from the brim of his worn Stetson. The town looked deserted, most folks having taken shelter from nature's fury. But something made him pause outside the ramshackle boarding house on Elm Street. "Save Mama," came the small voice, barely audible above the howling wind. Jake's weathered hands tightened on the reins as he turned toward the sound. Through the rain-streaked window of the boarding house, he glimpsed a small figure pressed against the glass. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, with tangled auburn hair and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. Her tiny palm was splayed against the window, and her lips moved again with the same desperate plea. "Save Mama." Something deep in Jake's chest twisted. He'd been riding through Cedar Falls with no intention of stopping, just another town on his endless journey west. At 32, he'd convinced himself he was better off alone, that caring for others only led to heartbreak. But those two words, spoken with such raw desperation, shattered the walls he'd built around his heart. He dismounted and approached the window, his boots squelching in the mud. The little girl's eyes widened as she saw him, and she pressed both hands against the glass. Up close, Jake could see the tear tracks on her dirty cheeks, the way her small shoulders shook with exhaustion and fear. "What's wrong, little one?" he called through the glass, his voice gentle despite the storm. The girl's mouth opened, but before she could speak, a harsh voice bellowed from inside the building. "Emma, get away from that window." The child flinched and stepped back, but not before Jake saw the terror that flashed across her face. She shook her head frantically and mouthed the words again. "Save Mama." Jake's jaw clenched. He'd seen enough in his years as a drifter to recognize the signs of trouble, and everything about this situation screamed danger. The boarded-up windows, the girl's obvious fear, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to drag her away at any moment. "Emma," the voice came again, closer now, and Jake heard heavy footsteps approaching. The little girl looked at him one last time, her eyes pleading, before disappearing into the shadows of the boarding house. Jake stood there for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, telling himself that other people's problems weren't his concern, but something about that little girl's desperate whisper had awakened something in him that he thought had died long ago. He thought of his own sister, Sarah, who'd been about Emma's age when she'd died of fever. He thought of all the times he'd wished someone would have saved her, saved their family, from the poverty and desperation that had torn them apart. He thought of the promises he'd made to himself to never get involved again, to never care enough to get hurt. But as he stood there in the storm, watching the empty window where Emma had been, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to ride away. Not this time. Whatever was happening in that boarding house, whatever danger that little girl and her mama were facing, he was going to do something about it. "I'll save you both," he whispered into the storm, and meant every word. Jake spent the next hour circling the boarding house, his trained eye cataloging every detail. The building was older than most in Cedar Falls, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. Several windows were boarded up, and the ones that weren't were covered with heavy curtains. The front door bore a sign that read "Rooms for Rent," but something about the place felt wrong, like a trap waiting to be sprung. He tied his horse to a post behind the general store and made his way back through the rain. The storm provided perfect cover as he crept closer to the building, listening for any sounds from within. What he heard made his blood run cold. A woman's voice, weak and pleading. "Please, I'll do anything. Just don't hurt Emma." A man's harsh laughter followed, cruel and mocking. "You'll do what you're told, or the little brat pays the price. You know the rules, Clara." Jake's hands balled into fists. He'd heard enough to understand the situation now. This wasn't just a boarding house. It was something much darker. The woman, Clara, was being held against her will, and her daughter Emma was being used as leverage to keep her compliant. He needed more information before he could act. Moving carefully around the building, he found a loose board near the back. That allowed him to peer inside. Through a crack in the wall, he could see into what looked like a kitchen. A heavy-set man with greasy hair sat at a table, counting money while a thin woman with scared eyes scrubbed dishes at a washbasin. "You've got 3 more customers coming tonight," the man said without looking up. "Make sure you're ready for them." The woman's shoulders sagged, and she nodded silently. Jake's jaw clenched as he realized what kind of operation this was. Clara wasn't just being held captive. She was being forced into prostitution, with her daughter's safety as the threat keeping her in line. He'd seen this before in other towns. Predators who preyed on desperate women and children, but he'd never gotten involved, always telling himself it wasn't his fight. This time was different. This time, he'd made a promise to a little girl who'd whispered for help. Jake crept around to the front of the building, studying the layout. The boarding house was 3 stories tall, with multiple rooms. He counted at least 4 men's voices from inside, all of them rough and dangerous sounding. The odds weren't great, but he'd faced worse. As he watched, a man emerged from the front door, collar turned up against the rain. Jake got a good look at him, a tall, lean figure with a scar running down his left cheek. The man mounted a horse and rode off into the storm, leaving 3 men inside by Jake's count. Jake waited until the rider disappeared into the rain, before moving closer to the building. Through a gap in the curtains, he spotted Emma huddled in a corner of what looked like a parlor. She was clutching a raggedy doll, her small body shaking with cold or fear or both. Her eyes were fixed on a doorway, where voices drifted from another room. "Mama will be back soon," she whispered to her doll, rocking back and forth. "Someone will save us. Someone has to." Jake's heart broke at the sight. He'd been about her age, when his own world had fallen apart, when he'd learned that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who hurt you most. He'd sworn never to be that vulnerable again, but looking at Emma, he realized that protecting others might be the only way to heal the wounds in his own soul. He needed a plan. 3 men, possibly more, all of them likely armed and dangerous. He had the element of surprise, but that would only last so long. He thought about writing to the sheriff's office, but something told him the law in Cedar Falls might not be entirely trustworthy. A town this size, with an operation like this running openly, suggested corruption ran deep. No, he would have to handle this himself. Jake Morrison had spent 15 years drifting from town to town, avoiding responsibility and commitment. But, as he watched Emma clutch her doll and whisper prayers into the storm, he knew his wandering days were over. He'd found something worth fighting for, worth staying for. He was going to save them both, just as he'd promised. And God help anyone who tried to stop him. Jake retreated to the livery stable where he'd sheltered his horse, his mind racing with possibilities. The stable keeper, an elderly man named Pete, was hunched over a cup of coffee, trying to stay warm. "Terrible storm," Pete said, glancing up as Jake entered. "Don't see many folks out in weather like this." Jake nodded, studying the old man's weathered face. Something about Pete's eyes suggested he'd seen more than his share of trouble. "That boarding house on Elm Street," Jake said carefully. "You know anything about it?" Pete's expression darkened, and he glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "You'd be wise to stay away from that place, stranger. Nothing good happens there." "What kind of nothing good?" Pete hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The kind that involves desperate women and men, with more money than conscience." "Sheriff Davidson, let's just say he's not inclined to investigate certain establishments in this town." Jake's suspicions about local corruption were confirmed. "What about the woman and child inside? Clara and little Emma?" Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. "Clara came to town about 6 months ago, running from something. She was near starving, and Emma was sick. That snake Donnelly, he runs the place. He offered them shelter. By the time Clara realized what kind of shelter it was too late. He's got her trapped, using the little girl as leverage. How many men does Donnelly have? Usually 4 or 5, but with this storm, some of them might be elsewhere." "Why are you asking all these questions, stranger?" Jake looked Pete in the eye. "Because I'm going to get that woman and child out of there." Pete's eyes widened. "You're talking about suicide, son. Donnelly's got connections all over this county. Even if you could get them out, where would you go? He'd hunt you down like a dog. Then I'll have to make sure he can't hunt anyone ever again." The old man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You remind me of someone I used to know. A man who couldn't stand to see injustice, and did something about it." He paused, then added, "That man died young, but he died with his conscience clear." Jake considered this. "Pete, I need to know everything about that building. How many ways in and out, where the rooms are, anything that might help." Pete glanced around again, then pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching. "I used to do some work over there, before I realized what kind of place it was. There's a back entrance through the kitchen, and a side door that leads to the cellar. The main staircase is in the front hall, but there's a servant's stair in the back." Jake studied the rough floor plan. "Where do they keep Clara and Emma?" "Clara's Room is on the second floor, front of the building. Emma, they usually keep her in the kitchen area during the day, or in a small room off the parlor. Poor little thing. She's like a ghost, always whispering about saving her mama. Jake's chest tightened. He'd heard that whisper himself, and it had changed everything. What about weapons? Are Donnelly's men armed? Always, they're not just running a brothel. They're involved in other things too. Cattle rustling, robbery, you name it. This is just their base of operations. A plan began to form in Jake's mind. It was risky, but it might work. The storm would provide cover, and with at least one of Donnelly's men already gone, the odds were slightly better. Pete, I need you to do something for me. In about 2 hours, I want you to create a distraction. Nothing dangerous, just something to draw attention to the front of the building. Pete nodded slowly. I think I can manage that. But son, you sure? About this folks in there, they're not your responsibility. Jake thought about Emma's desperate whisper, about Clara's pleading voice, about all the times in his life when no one had come to help when help was needed. Maybe not, he said, but sometimes you have to make something your responsibility. As the storm continued to rage outside, Jake began preparing for what might be the most important fight of his life. He cleaned his weapons, checked his ammunition, and went over the plan again and again. When he closed his eyes, he could still see Emma's small face pressed against the window, her lips forming those two words that had changed everything. Save Mama. Tonight he was going to do exactly that. Jake waited until the clock tower chimed midnight before making his move. The storm had intensified, lightning splitting the sky, and thunder rolling across the valley like cannon fire. Perfect conditions for what he had planned. He approached the boarding house from the rear, his boots silent on the muddy ground, despite the chaos of the weather. The building loomed before him, most of its windows dark except for a few glowing with lamplight. Through the kitchen window, he could see a single figure hunched over a table, a bottle of whiskey keeping him company. Pete's distraction had worked perfectly. 20 minutes earlier, a fire had mysteriously started in a trash pile behind the general store. Nothing dangerous, but enough to draw 2 of Donnelly's men out into the storm to investigate. That left 3 men inside, assuming Jake's count was correct. He crept to the cellar door Pete had marked on the map. The lock was old and rusted, and Jake's years of less than legal activities served him well. Within minutes, he was inside, listening to the sounds of the house above him. The cellar was dark and musty, filled with crates and barrels. Jake moved carefully, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. A thin line of light showed under the door that led to the kitchen, and he could hear voices from somewhere above. Told you to keep her quiet. A man's voice growled. She's just scared, came Clara's voice, barely audible. Please, let me go to her. You'll stay put until your next customer arrives. And if I hear one more peep out of that brat, be consequences. Jake's blood boiled. He'd heard enough. Moving like a shadow, he climbed the narrow stairs to the kitchen door. Through the keyhole, he could see the man at the table, his back turned to the door. A gun belt hung on the back of his chair, within easy reach but not immediately accessible. Jake eased the door open and stepped into the kitchen. The man was drunker than Jake had initially thought, his head nodding as he fought sleep. This was almost too easy. Evening, Jake said quietly. The man spun around, reaching for his gun, but Jake was faster. A quick blow to the head with the butt of his pistol, and the man slumped forward onto the table. Unconscious, Jake quickly secured the man's weapons and moved toward the parlor. According to Pete's map, Emma should be in a small room just off the main area. He found her exactly where Pete had said, curled up on a thin mattress, clutching her doll. Emma, he whispered, kneeling beside her. The little girl's eyes flew open, and she started to cry out before Jake gently placed a finger to his lips. Sweetheart, I'm here to help. Remember me from the window. Emma's eyes widened with recognition, and she nodded frantically. You said you'd save us both, she whispered. That's right, but I need you to be very brave and very quiet. Can you do that for me? Emma nodded again, clutching her doll tighter. Mama's upstairs. They won't let me see her. I know. We're going to get her right now. But first, I need you to hide somewhere safe while I take care of the bad men. Can you go back to the cellar and wait for me there? Emma's face scrunched up with worry. What if they hurt you? Jake's heart clenched at the concern in her voice. When was the last time someone had worried about him? I'll be fine, sweetheart, I promise. But your mama needs my help, and I can't help her if I'm worried about you. The cellar is right through that door. Down the stairs. There's a place behind Some crates where you can hide. Emma nodded solemnly and slipped off the mattress. Will you really save Mama? I swear it on my life. As Emma disappeared into the cellar, Jake heard footsteps on the stairs above. Heavy boots, moving purposefully. He pressed himself against the wall beside the staircase, gun drawn, as a man descended. Billy, what the hell is taking so long with it? Man spotted the unconscious figure in the kitchen and went for his gun. Jake stepped out from behind the staircase, his own weapon trained on the man's chest. Don't, Jake said quietly. Just don't. The man froze, his hand halfway to his holster. He was young, probably not much older than Jake had been when he'd started his wandering life. There was fear in his eyes, but also a desperate kind of cunning. You're making a mistake, mister, the man said. You have no idea who you're messing with. I know exactly who I'm messing with, Jake replied. The question is, do you want to live to see morning? The man's hand moved slightly toward his gun, and Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. But before either man could act, a scream echoed. From upstairs, raw and filled with terror, Clara's voice, calling for Emma. Jake's blood turned to ice. The distraction had given him the advantage, but it had also revealed his presence. Donnelly knew someone was in the house, and he was using Clara to draw them out. Emma. Clara's voice came again, desperate now. Where are you? The man in front of Jake smiled coldly. Sounds like the boss found your weakness, stranger. You better drop that gun, or things are going to get very unpleasant for the lady upstairs. Jake's mind raced. He'd managed to take out one man and corner another, but Donnelly still had Clara, and the sound of her terror was like a knife in his chest. Every instinct told him to charge upstairs, but he knew that would only get Clara killed. Tell your boss I want to talk, Jake said, his gun still trained on the man. Tell him I have a proposition. The man's eyes narrowed. What kind of proposition? The kind that keeps everyone breathing. Move. As they headed toward the stairs, Jake's mind was already working on the next phase of his plan. He'd gotten Emma to safety, but Clara was still in danger, and Donnelly was clearly more cunning than his men. This was about to get a lot more complicated. But Jake had made a promise to a little girl who'd whispered for help, and he intended to keep it, no matter what it cost him. The parlor on the second floor was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting long shadows across the worn furniture. Donnelly stood near the window, one arm wrapped around Clara's throat, a knife pressed against her neck. He was a large man, soft around the middle but with the hard eyes of someone who'd done terrible things and slept well afterward. Clara's eyes were wide with terror, and Jake could see bruises on her arms where rough hands had grabbed her. She was younger than he'd expected, probably not much older than 25, with the kind of fragile beauty that men like Donnelly saw as something to be owned and broken. So you're the knight in shining armor, Donnelly said, his voice dripping with mockery, come to rescue the damsel in distress. Jake kept his gun trained on the man he'd captured, but his eyes were on Donnelly. Let her go. Your quarrel is with me. Donnelly laughed, a sound like breaking glass. My quarrel is with anyone who interferes with my business. You have no idea what you've walked into, stranger. I know enough. I know you're holding this woman against her will, using her child as leverage. I know you're running a criminal operation. Out of this building. Criminal. Donnelly's grip tightened on Clara, and she whimpered. I'm providing a service. These women, they come to me desperate, starving, with nowhere else to turn. I give them shelter, food, purpose. You give them slavery. I give them what they're worth. Donnelly's eyes were cold as winter. This one here, she came to me begging for help. Her husband ran off, left her with nothing but a brat to feed. I took her in, gave her a roof over her head, and all I ask in return is that she earn her keep. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. By selling her body. By using what God gave her. It's honest work, more honest than most. Clara's eyes met Jake's across the room, and he saw something there that made his chest tight. Not just fear, but hope. She believed he could save her, just as her daughter had believed. The weight of that faith was almost crushing. What do you want? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. I want you to put down your gun and walk away. Forget you ever saw this place. Forget about the woman and the child. Keep riding west like you were before, and everyone stays breathing. And if I don't? Donnelly's knife moved slightly against Clara's throat, and a thin line of blood appeared. Then the woman dies, and you get to live with the knowledge that your heroic gesture got an innocent person killed. Jake's mind raced. He could try to take the shot, but Donnelly was using Clara as a shield, and the risk of hitting her was too great. He could try to negotiate, but men like Donnelly didn't negotiate. They only took. There's a third option, Jake said quietly. Oh, and what's that? You let the woman go, and I'll take her place. You want leverage? I'm worth more than she is. I've got money, connections, people who'll pay to get me back. Donnelly's eyes narrowed with interest. You're lying. Try me. But first, let her go. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of the storm raging outside. Then Donnelly smiled, and Jake knew he'd made a mistake. You know what I think? Donnelly said. I think you're just some drifter who got a case of the conscience. I think you've got nothing to offer me, except a bullet in the back the first chance you get. Then we have a problem. No, Donnelly said, pressing the knife harder against Clara's throat. You have a problem. That's when Jake heard it, the sound that changed everything. A small voice, barely audible above the storm, coming from downstairs. Mama Emma. She was supposed to be hiding in the cellar, but she'd heard her mother's scream and come looking for her. Jake's heart lurched as he realized what was about to happen. Donnelly heard it too, and his smile widened. Well, looks like the little mouse came out of her hole. Tommy, go fetch the brat. The man Jake had been holding moved toward the door, but Jake shifted his aim. Don't you shoot him. I cut her throat, Donnelly said calmly. You let him go, and maybe we can work something out. Your choice, hero. Jake's mind was spinning. He'd planned for a lot of contingencies, but not this. Not Emma putting herself in danger by coming back into the house. Every option he considered led to someone getting hurt. Mama. Emma's voice came again, closer now. She was climbing the stairs. Jake made his decision. In one fluid motion, he shoved the man beside him toward Donnelly, while diving to the side. The room exploded into chaos as Donnelly cursed and struggled with his own man, momentarily losing his grip on Clara. Clara broke free and ran toward the door. But Donnelly recovered quickly, his knife flashing in the lamplight. Jake rolled to his feet and fired, the bullet catching Donnelly in the shoulder and spinning him around. But it wasn't enough. Donnelly roared in pain and fury, raising his knife to throw it at Clara's retreating figure. Jake fired again, this time aiming for the center of mass, and Donnelly dropped to the floor, the knife clattering across the boards. Mama. Emma burst through the door, her doll clutched in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Clara scooped her daughter up, both of them crying now, holding each other like they'd never let go. Jake stood in the middle of the room, his gun still smoking, looking at the man he'd just killed. He'd taken lives before, but never like this, never for someone else. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a stone. But when he looked at Clara and Emma, safe in each other's arms, he knew he'd do it again without hesitation. It's over, he said quietly. You're both safe now. But even as he said it, Jake knew it wasn't really over. It was just beginning. The storm had finally begun to subside by the time the sheriff arrived. Pete had gone to fetch him once the shooting stopped, and Sheriff Davidson stood in the parlor, looking at Donnelly's body, with an expression that was hard to read. Self-defense, Jake said, though he kept his hand near his gun. He still wasn't sure how deep the corruption ran in Cedar Falls. Davidson nodded slowly. That's what the lady says to the little girl. He looked at Clara, who was sitting on a chair with Emma in her lap, both of them still shaking from the ordeal. You ladies all right? Clara nodded, though her voice was barely a whisper. He was going to kill us all. Donnelly was a cancer on this town, Davidson said. Surprising. I've been trying to build a case against him for months, but he had too many connections, too many people afraid to testify. What you did here tonight, stranger, it might have saved more lives than just these two. Jake studied the sheriff's face, looking for signs of deception. You weren't working with him. Davidson's expression hardened. I've been a lawman for 20 years. I might not be perfect, but I don't take money from men who hurt women and children. He paused, then added, though I'll admit, I've been slow to act. Too cautious, maybe. Wanted to be sure I had enough evidence to make it stick. Well, you've got plenty now, Jake said, gesturing around the room. This place is a treasure trove of evidence, account books, letters, probably enough to take down half his operation. Over the next few hours, as the storm finally passed and dawn broke over Cedar Falls, Jake watched the sheriff's men go through Donnelly's belongings. They found records of illegal activities stretching back years, connections to criminal organizations in 3 states, and enough evidence to put several of Donnelly's associates behind bars. But Jake's attention kept drifting to Clara and Emma. The little girl had barely left her mother's side, and Clara seemed lost. As if she couldn't quite believe they were finally free. What happens to them now? Jake asked Davidson privately. The sheriff shrugged. Clara's got no family here, no money. The boarding house will probably be sold to pay Donnelly's debts. I suppose they'll have to move on, try to start over somewhere else. Jake watched Emma whisper something to her mother, saw Clara's eyes fill with tears as she nodded. The little girl was asking about him, he realized, asking if he was going to leave. They need protection, Jake said. Donnelly had partners, people who might want revenge. True enough. But I can't spare a man to follow them around indefinitely. Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his life, about the years he'd spent drifting from place to place with no real purpose. He thought about Emma's whispered plea, about the promise he'd made to save them both. What if someone volunteered to look out for them? Davidson raised an eyebrow. Someone like you, maybe. You thinking of settling down? Stranger, Cedar Falls could use a good man. Someone who's not afraid to stand up for what's right. Jake looked around the room, at the evidence of Donnelly's crimes, at the lives that had been saved. Then he looked at Clara and Emma, huddled together on the chair, and something in his chest loosened. Maybe, he said again. Later, as the sun climbed higher, and the last of the storm clouds drifted away, Jake found himself alone with Clara and Emma in the parlor. The bodies had been removed, the evidence catalogued, and the immediate danger was over. But the future stretched out before them, uncertain and full of questions. Thank you, Clara said, her voice stronger now. I don't know how to repay you. You don't need to repay me, Jake said. But I need to ask you something. What are you going to do now? Where will you go? Clara's composure cracked slightly. I don't know. I have some relatives back east, but I don't know if they'd take us in. And the money to get there. She trailed off, looking defeated. Emma tugged on her mother's skirt. Mama, is the cowboy going to stay with us? Clara looked at Jake, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. Something that spoke of possibilities he'd never allowed himself to imagine. I don't know, sweetheart, Clara said softly. That's up to him. Jake knelt down so he was at Emma's eye level. Would you like me to stay? Emma nodded vigorously. You promised to save us both. You kept your promise. I did, Jake said. And I always keep my promises. He stood up and looked at Clara. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Help you get back on your feet, make sure you're safe. Clara's eyes filled with tears. You don't owe us anything. You've done enough. This isn't about owing, Jake said. This is about wanting. I've spent 15 years running from everything that mattered. Maybe it's time I stopped running. For the first time since he'd met her, Clara smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. And in that moment, Jake Morrison knew he'd found something worth staying for, something worth building a life around. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the doorway of the small house he'd rented on the outskirts of town, watching Clara hang laundry on the line, while Emma played in the yard with a new doll he'd bought her. The scene was so peaceful, so normal, that it almost didn't feel real. He'd used most of his savings to secure the house and buy basic necessities, but he didn't regret it. Clara had protested, insisting she didn't want to be a burden. But Jake had gently explained that it wasn't charity, it was investment. An investment in a future he was just beginning to imagine. You're brooding again, Clara said, walking up to him with the empty laundry basket. Over the past weeks, she'd grown more confident, more like the woman she'd been before. Donnelly had broken her spirit. The bruises had faded, and there was color in her cheeks again. Just thinking, Jake said, taking the basket from her hands. Their fingers touched briefly, and he felt that familiar spark of electricity he'd been trying to ignore. About what? About work. Sheriff Davidson offered me a deputy position, but I'm not sure I'm cut out for law enforcement. Clara studied his face. You were cut out for it 3 weeks ago, when you saved us. That was different. That was personal. And this wouldn't be. Clara gestured toward the town. These people, this place, it's becoming personal too, isn't it? Jake couldn't deny it. Cedar Falls was growing on him, and not just because of Clara and Emma. The townsfolk had welcomed him with a warmth he'd never experienced before. They saw him as a hero, the man who'd rid their town of a cancer that had been eating away at it for years. The pay's not much, Jake said. Barely enough to support myself, let alone, ... Let alone, what? Clara's voice was gentle but probing. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the question in her eyes. They'd been dancing around it for weeks now. the growing attraction between them, the way Emma had started calling him Jake instead of Mr., the way Clara's hand sometimes lingered on his arm when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Let alone a family, he finished quietly. Clara's breath caught. Is that what you want? A family, I want. Jake struggled for words. I want something I've never had. A home. People who matter to me. People I matter to. You matter to us, Clara said, stepping closer. You matter more than you know. Before Jake could respond, Emma came running over, her new doll clutched in her arms. Jake, Mama, look what I found. She held up a small flower, wilted but still beautiful, that had somehow survived the storm from weeks ago. It's like us, she said solemnly. It got hurt, but it's still growing. Jake knelt down and took the flower from her small hands. You're right, sweetheart. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that survive the worst storms. Emma beamed at him, then looked at her mother. Mama, are you going to marry Jake? Clara's face turned red, and Jake felt his own cheeks burning. Emma, you can't just ask people things like that. But I want Jake to be my daddy, Emma said matter-of-factly. He protects us and takes care of us and reads me stories at night. That's what daddies do, right? Jake's heart clenched. He'd never thought about being a father, never imagined he'd be any good at it. But watching Emma over the past weeks, seeing her slowly heal from the trauma she'd endured, he'd started to understand what it meant to love someone unconditionally. Emma, honey, relationships are complicated, Clara said gently. But love isn't, Jake said quietly, surprising himself. Both Clara and Emma looked at him with wide eyes. Love is the simplest thing in the world. It's everything else that's complicated. He stood up, still holding the flower, and looked at Clara. I've been thinking about what you said, about things becoming personal. You're right. This town, this life, you and Emma, ... It's all become personal. More personal than anything I've ever known. Clara's eyes were shining. Jake ... I know it's too soon, he said quickly. I know we've only known each other for a few weeks, and I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm a drifter with no real trade, no family, no prospects beyond what Sheriff Davidson offered. But, Clara prompted, but I love you, Jake said, the words coming out in a rush. I love both of you. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that some promises are worth keeping. Emma clapped her hands together. Does that mean yes? Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. I think it means we need to talk about it. Can we talk about it over dinner? Jake asked. I was thinking of making my famous beans and hardtack. Your only recipe, Clara corrected, wiping her eyes. My only recipe, Jake agreed. But I make it with love. As they walked back toward the house, Emma skipping ahead of them, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of something positive, something worth fighting for. Sheriff Davidson was waiting on the porch, his hat in his hands. Evening, folks. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. We got word from the territorial marshal. Donnelly's operation was bigger than we thought. They've arrested 6 more men in connection with it, and they're asking for your testimony. Jake's stomach tightened. When? Next month. In Denver. The trial's expected to last a week, maybe 2. Clara's face went pale. What if his associates come looking for revenge while you're gone? I'll leave to deputies here, Davidson said. And the marshal's office is offering protective custody if you want it. Jake looked at Clara, saw the fear creeping back into her eyes. I don't have to go, he said. They have plenty of evidence without my testimony. Yes, you do, Clara said firmly. Those men need to pay for what they did. How many other women and children are they hurting? How many other families are they destroying? She's right, Davidson said. Your testimony could put them away for life. Jake nodded slowly. Then I'll go. But I want your word that Clara and Emma will be protected. You have it. That evening, as they sat around the small dining table, sharing Jake's beans and hardtack, the conversation turned to the future. Emma had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted from the day's excitement, and Clara was gently stroking her daughter's hair. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Clara said quietly, about love being simple. It is, Jake said. At least, it should be. I love you too, Clara said. The words so soft Jake almost didn't hear them. I think I started falling for you that first night, when you could have just ridden away but chose to stay. I couldn't leave, Jake said. Even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't have left you. What happens when you go to Denver? Jake reached across the table and took her hand. I come back. I'll always come back, Clara. That's what love means to me. It means having somewhere to come home to. Clara squeezed his hand. Then ask me. Ask you, what? What Emma wanted you to ask me. Jake's heart started racing. Clara Mitchell, will you marry me? Yes, she said, without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Morrison. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Jake could swear he heard her whisper, I knew it. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison had a future that stretched beyond the next town, the next job, the next job, the next sunrise. He had a home, a family, and a love that would anchor him through any storm. And it had all started with a little girl's desperate whisper, "Save Mama." Denver was larger and more intimidating than Jake had expected. The territorial courthouse loomed over the city like a monument to justice, its stone walls and imposing columns designed to make men feel small. Jake stood on the steps, adjusting his one good suit, trying to calm his nerves. It had been 2 months since the shooting at Donnelly's boarding house, and Clara was now visibly pregnant with their child. They'd married in a simple ceremony at the Cedar Falls church, with Emma as their flower girl and half the town in attendance. The memory of Clara's radiant smile as she walked down the aisle sustained him now, gave him strength for what lay ahead. Morrison, a tall man in an expensive suit, approached him. I'm Federal Marshal Tom Bradley. We spoke in the telegram correspondence. Jake shook the man's hand. Marshal, thank you for arranging the protection for my family. My pleasure. What you did in Cedar Falls, it broke open a network we've been trying to crack for years. Donnelly was small fish, but he was connected to some very big fish. They walked into the courthouse together, and Jake was struck by the gravity of the place. This wasn't like the simple justice of the frontier, where disputes were settled with fists or guns. This was civilization, with all its complexity and ceremony. The defense is going to try to paint you as a vigilante, Bradley warned. They'll claim you murdered Donnelly in cold blood, that you were after his money or his women. Let them try, Jake said grimly. I've got nothing to hide. The trial lasted 6 days. Jake testified on the 3rd day, telling the jury about Emma's whispered plea, about what he'd found in that boarding house, about the choice he'd made to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The defense attorney, a slick man named Harrington, did exactly what Bradley had predicted. He painted Jake as a drifter and a killer, suggested that his relationship with Clara had begun before Donnelly's death, implied that the whole rescue had been a ruse to steal another man's woman. Isn't it true, Mr. Morrison, Harrington said, during cross-examination, that you had been watching the boarding house for days before the alleged rescue? I'd been in town for less than 4 hours when I first saw Emma at the window. Jake replied calmly. But you admit you were attracted to Mrs. Mitchell from the beginning. Jake thought about objecting, but decided honesty was the better course. I was attracted to her courage, to her love for her daughter, to the way she'd endured hell and still managed to hold on to her humanity. So you killed a man to win a woman. I killed a man to save a woman and child from slavery and abuse, Jake said firmly. If I'd wanted to win Clara, I would have courted her properly, not shot my way through a building full of armed men. The courtroom erupted in laughter, and even the judge smiled. Harrington looked frustrated, but pressed on. You've killed before, haven't you, Mr. Morrison? Jake had been dreading this question. Yes. How many men have you killed? 4, including Donnelly. And you expect this jury to believe that you're some kind of hero? Jake looked at the jury. 12 men who would decide, not just his fate, but the fate of the criminal network that had destroyed so many lives. I don't expect anything, he said quietly. I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who couldn't stand by and watch innocent people suffer. The prosecutor, a young man named Stevens, did his best to rehabilitate Jake's testimony. He called Clara as a witness, and she testified via telegram from Cedar Falls, describing the horrors she and Emma had endured, the way Jake had risked his life to save them. But it was Emma's testimony that proved most powerful. Stevens had arranged for her words to be recorded and read to the jury. And there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when the clerk read her simple statement. The bad men hurt my mama and made her cry. They scared me and wouldn't let me hug her. Then Jake came and made the bad men go away. He promised to save us both, and he kept his promise. Jake is good. Jake loves us. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced their verdict. We find the defendants guilty on all charges. Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The criminal network that had operated across 3 territories was broken. Its leaders, facing long prison sentences. Justice had been served, not just for Clara and Emma, but for all the victims who had suffered in silence. After the trial, Marshal Bradley approached Jake outside the courthouse. "You did good work in there, Morrison. Ever think about becoming a federal marshal?" Jake considered the offer. The pay was good, and the work was important. But his thoughts turned to Clara, waiting for him in Cedar Falls, her belly growing round with their child. "I appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I've got a family now. I need to be where they are." Bradley nodded. "I understand. But if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. The territory needs more men like you." As Jake boarded the train back to Cedar Falls, he thought about the path that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been a drifter with no purpose, no home, no one who cared whether he lived or died. Now he was a husband, a father-to-be, and a man with a future worth fighting for. The train pulled away from the station, carrying him home, to the woman who'd changed his life and the little girl who'd whispered for help in a storm. He'd kept his promise to save them both, and in doing so, he'd saved himself. The train pulled into Cedar Falls just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake stepped onto the platform, his heart racing with anticipation. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, the longest he'd been away from Clara and Emma since they'd become a family. He spotted them immediately. Clara stood near the station house, her pregnancy now obvious even beneath her winter coat. Emma was beside her, jumping up and down with excitement, her face beaming as she caught sight of him. "Jake, Jake." Emma broke free from her mother's hand and ran toward him, her arms outstretched. Jake dropped his bag and caught her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed with pure joy. "I missed you so much, sweetheart. I missed you too." Mama cried every night, but she said it was just because the baby makes her emotional. Clara approached more slowly, her eyes bright with tears. "Welcome home," she said softly. "Jake," said Emma, down and pulled his wife into his arms, careful of her growing belly. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here," Clara said, burying her face in his shoulder. "How did it go?" "Guilty on all charges." "It's over, Clara. Really over." Clara pulled back to look at him, and Jake saw the relief in her eyes. For months, she'd been carrying the fear that Donnelly's associates might come for revenge. Now, finally, she could breathe freely. "Come on," she said, taking his arm. "Let's go home. I have a surprise for you." They walked through the town together, and Jake noticed how many people stopped to wave or call out greetings. Cedar Falls had truly become home in a way he'd never expected. These people knew him, cared about him, considered him part of their community. The house looked different when they arrived. Someone had painted the shutters a cheerful blue, and there were new curtains in the windows. The small garden Clara had planted in the spring was now bare but neatly tended, ready for winter. "Sheriff Davidson organized a work party while you were gone," Clara explained. "Half the town showed up to help with repairs and improvements. They wanted to make sure everything was perfect for when you came home." Jake was touched by the gesture. "I'll have to thank them." "You can thank them tomorrow. Tonight, you're mine." Inside the house was warm and welcoming. Clara had cooked his favorite meal, beef stew with fresh bread, and the smell made his mouth water. But it was the new addition to the parlor that caught his attention. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace, beautifully crafted from oak and polished to a warm glow. Beside it was a small cradle, equally well made. "Mrs. Henderson organized the ladies' circle to make baby clothes," Clara said, watching his reaction. "And Tom Bradley, the carpenter, he made the cradle. Said every baby deserves to be welcomed properly." Jake ran his hand over the smooth wood of the cradle, imagining their child sleeping peacefully inside it. "It's beautiful." "There's more," Emma said, tugging on his sleeve. "Show him the letters, Mama." Clara went to the kitchen and returned with a stack of envelopes. "These came while you were gone. Job offers, Jake. 3 different ranchers want to hire you as foreman. And there's a letter from the territorial governor's office." Jake opened the letter from the governor's office, his eyebrows rising as he read. "They want to offer me a position as territorial marshal for this district." "What does that mean?" Clara asked. "It means I'd be responsible for law enforcement across several counties. Good pay, steady work, and I'd be based here in Cedar Falls." Emma climbed onto his lap. "Does that mean you wouldn't have to go away anymore?" "That's exactly what it means, sweetheart." As they sat down to dinner, Jake told them about the trial, about the conviction of Donnelly's associates, about the marshal's offer he'd declined. Clara listened with pride in her eyes, and Jake realized that he'd found something he'd never known he was looking for, a woman who believed in him completely. "I want to accept the territorial marshal position," he said. but only if you're comfortable with it. It could be dangerous work sometimes. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. Jake Morrison. I fell in love with a man who rode into a storm to save strangers. I'm not about to ask you to stop being who you are. But I want to be safe, Emma piped up. I want you to come home every night and read me stories. I'll do my best, sweetheart. I promise. Later, after Emma had gone to bed, Jake and Clara sat in the parlor by the fire. Clara was in the new rocking chair, her hands resting on her belly, and Jake was on the floor beside her, his head against her knee. I felt the baby kick today, Clara said softly. Strong kicks. I think he's going to be a fighter like his father. Jake looked up at her. You think it's a boy? I know it is, and I know what I want to name him. What, Samuel? After my father, Samuel Morrison. Jake's throat tightened. I'd like that. Samuel Morrison. It has a good sound to it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Jake thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a rootless drifter to a man with a family, a home, and a future. Clara, he said eventually, do you ever regret it? The way we met? The circumstances? Clara's hand stilled on her belly. Do you mean, do I regret that you saved us from hell? Do I regret that you gave us a chance at happiness? I mean, do you regret not having a normal courtship? Not having time to really know each other before we married? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Jake, I knew everything I needed to know about you the night you walked into that boarding house. I knew you were brave and kind, and that you'd put yourself in danger to protect people you didn't even know. Everything else, we've learned together. And what have you learned? Clara smiled down at him. I've learned that you snore when you sleep on your back. I've learned that you can't cook anything besides beans and hardtack. I've learned that you read the newspaper from back to front, and that you always put Emma's needs before your own. And I've learned that some people are worth waiting a lifetime for, even if you only have to wait a few weeks. Jake reached up and took her hand. I love you, Clara Morrison. I love you too, Jake Morrison. And so does the little girl who's probably listening at the top of the stairs right now. Jake chuckled. Emma, you might as well come down and join us. Small feet pattered on the stairs, and Emma appeared in her nightgown, grinning sheepishly. I wasn't listening. I was just ... checking to make sure you were really home. I'm home, Jake said, opening his arms. And I'm staying. Emma crawled into his lap, and the three of them sat together by the fire, a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the promises they'd made to each other in the midst of a storm. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and reminding them of the night that had changed everything. But inside, they were safe and warm and together. And that was all that mattered. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his home, watching his children play in the yard. Emma, now 11, was teaching her little brother Samuel how to braid rope, her patience infinite as his small fingers fumbled with the strands. At 3 years old, Samuel was fearless and curious, traits that both delighted and terrified his parents. Clara appeared beside Jake, her arm slipping around his waist. At 29, she was even more beautiful than the day he'd married her, her face glowing with contentment and the quiet confidence of a woman who'd found her place in the world. Marshal Davidson sent word, she said, holding up a telegram. The cattle rustlers have been caught. Your reputation as territorial marshal is spreading, Mr. Morrison. Jake smiled, pulling her closer. Our reputation, you mean? I couldn't do this job without you. It was true. In the 5 years since he'd accepted the territorial marshal position, Clara had become his unofficial partner. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to spot lies and deceptions that escaped even Jake's trained eye. More than once, her insights had helped him solve cases that had seemed impossible. Mama, Jake, Emma called from the yard. Come see what Samuel learned. They walked over to find Samuel holding up a perfectly braided length of rope, his face beaming with pride. I did it. I did it like Emma showed me. That's wonderful, son, Jake said, ruffling the boy's dark hair. Samuel had inherited his mother's quick mind and his father's determination, along with a stubborn streak that could be both endearing and exasperating. Can I be a marshal like you when I grow up? Samuel asked, as he did at least once a week. You can be whatever you want to be, Jake replied, as he always did. But first, you have to finish learning to read and write and do your sums. Samuel made a face. Reading is hard. Everything worth doing is hard at first, Emma said, sounding wise beyond her years. But Mama says that's what makes it worth doing. Jake looked at his daughter with pride. Emma had blossomed in the years since their rescue, growing from a frightened little girl into a confident young woman. She was smart and brave and kind, with a fierce protective instinct toward her family that reminded Jake of her mother. Speaking of reading, Clara said, "You have a letter, Jake, from back east." Jake took the envelope she offered, recognizing the handwriting immediately. His brother's wife, Sarah, the only family he'd had contact with in 15 years. "What does it say?" Clara asked gently. Jake read quickly, his expression growing serious. "My brother Daniel is dead. Pneumonia. Sarah's asking if she and the children can come stay with us until she gets back on her feet." "Of course they can," Clara said without hesitation. "Family is family." "You don't know Sarah," Jake warned. "She's difficult. And Daniel's children, they're not used to the frontier life." "Then we'll teach them," Clara said firmly. "Just like this town taught us." That evening, after the children were in bed, Jake and Clara sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. Cedar Falls had grown in the years since Donnelly's death, becoming a proper town with a school, a church, and a doctor, but it had retained its sense of community, its willingness to help neighbors in need. "Are you worried about Sarah coming?" Clara asked. Jake considered the question. "A little. She never approved of my wandering ways, and she certainly won't approve of how we met." "Let her disapprove," Clara said with a smile. "We know what we have, Jake. We know what we've built together." "What have we built?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "A home," Clara said simply. "A real home, where people are loved unconditionally, where promises are kept, where children can grow up feeling safe and valued." Jake nodded, thinking about the path that had brought them here. "Do you ever think about that night? The storm, Donnelly's boarding house?" "Every day," Clara admitted, "but not with fear anymore. I think about how one moment of courage can change everything. How one person's decision to help can save not just lives, but souls." "Emma's whisper," Jake said. "Save Mama. If I hadn't heard that, double quotes, but you did hear it, and you chose to listen. That's what makes you who you are, Jake Morrison." A month later, Sarah arrived with her 2 children, 10-year-old Michael and 8-year-old Lucy. She was exactly as Jake remembered her, prim, proper, and quick to judge. Her first look at the frontier home, at Clara's simple dress and practical manner, spoke volumes. But Emma and Samuel had a way of winning hearts. And within a week, even Sarah was smiling at Samuel's antics and praising Emma's intelligence. Michael and Lucy, initially overwhelmed by the vastness of the territory, began to adapt under Emma's patient guidance. "You've built something remarkable here," Sarah admitted to Jake one evening, as they watched the children play together in the yard. "I didn't understand it at first, but I'm beginning to see it." "What do you see?" "A family," Sarah said. "Not just you and Clara and the children, but this whole town. They look out for each other, help each other. It's what I always thought family should be." Jake smiled. "Clara says a home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to love each other. She's a wise woman, and a lucky one." "I'm the lucky one," Jake said. "I spent 15 years running from everything that mattered. If I hadn't heard Emma's whisper that night, But you did hear it," Sarah said, echoing Clara's words, "and you chose to act. That's what makes you a good man, Jake. That's what makes you a good father." As the years passed, Jake's family continued to grow, not just in size, but in love and understanding. Sarah eventually remarried a widowed rancher named Thomas, who adored her children as if they were his own. Michael grew into a fine young man who chose to stay in Cedar Falls, becoming a deputy under Jake's guidance. Lucy became a teacher, devoted to educating the children of the frontier. Emma married a young doctor who came to town to replace the aging physician, and they built their own home just down the street from Jake and Clara. Samuel, true to his early promise, became a lawman like his father, but with a gentler touch and a gift for diplomacy that made him even more effective. Clara bore 2 more children, daughters they named Hope and Grace, who grew up in a house filled with love and laughter. And through it all, Jake never forgot the lesson that had changed his life. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen for the whisper of someone who needs help. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and the house was peaceful, Jake would sometimes walk through Cedar Falls, remembering the night he'd first arrived. He'd passed the spot where Donnelly's boarding house had stood, now replaced by a small church where Emma had been married and all his children baptized. He'd think about the storm, about the desperate whisper that had changed everything, about the promise he'd made to save them both, and he'd smile. knowing that he'd kept that promise in ways he'd never imagined. Clara would be waiting for him when he returned. Still beautiful, despite the silver in her hair. Still the woman who'd captured his heart in the midst of darkness. They'd sit together on the porch, watching the stars, and Jake would marvel at the life they'd built together. "Any regrets?" Clara would ask, as she did sometimes. "Only one," Jake would always reply. "That it took me so long to find you." And in the distance, if he listened carefully, he could almost hear it again. The whisper that had saved them all. The plea that had given him a purpose. The words that had transformed a rootless drifter into a man with a home and a family and a legacy worth leaving behind. "Save Mama," the wind would seem to whisper. And Jake Morrison would smile, knowing that he had done exactly that, and so much more. In the small cemetery behind the Cedar Falls Church, there stands a simple headstone with these words: Jake Morrison, beloved husband and father. He kept his promises. And visitors to the grave often leave small flowers, especially storm-battered ones that have survived against all odds, because they understand that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. The boarding house where it all began is long gone, replaced by a small park where children play and families gather. But on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the trees, some say you can still hear it, the whisper of hope that changed everything. The plea that proved one person's courage can save not just lives, but souls. "Save Mama," the wind seems to say. And in Cedar Falls, where love conquered fear and promises were kept, that whisper is answered still.